Today, we're blessed to have, again, Jonathan Schanzer, who really has been an incredible friend to FIDF. When we need an analysis, when we need an insight, we turn to Jonathan. And Jonathan, who spent his whole life really dedicated to this issue, first in the Treasury Department, then as the senior scholar at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He lives these issues. He has a perspective on these issues and insight like no one else. And we're very grateful that Jonathan is spending time with us, sharing us his thoughts, sharing us his perspective, and enabling us to ask him a number of questions. Jonathan, we want to hand it over to you. And once again, thank you.
Great, Steve. Thank you. Really wonderful to be with you. And as always, I appreciate our friendship and our opportunities to talk about these issues. Look, we're obviously watching an historic moment, not just in the wake of the election here in the United States, but I think an historic moment in the Middle East. I think there is a sense right now that a shift is taking place. The question is, to what end? There are reports right now that the Houthis out of Yemen, in the wake of the election here in the United States, have decided to declare an end to hostilities. We'll see if those reports bear out, but that might be a bellwether for the way that some of the other Iran-backed militias are trying to read the tea leaves in the wake of the election, that this is maybe a war that they can no longer sustain. But in the meanwhile, I think it's important to note a few things. First, what's happening in Gaza, I think we are truly watching the end of the Hamas terrorist group as we know it. I think it's now safe to say that this is a low-level insurgency that is sponsored by Iran and backed by the Qataris and the Turks. This is not the terrorist organization that carried out the 10/7 attacks. All of their fighting brigades are effectively dismantled. Their top leadership, as we know, has been liquidated by the Israelis. The above-ground infrastructure is gone, except for some of those hospitals that still double as command centers or communication hubs for Hamas. You know, I think the infrastructure that still exists is underground. The Israelis have mapped almost all of it. They've destroyed maybe 15%, maybe 20% of it. The only reason why they're moving slowly at this point is because they're still looking for those hostages. As we know, there are somewhere around 50, maybe 51 hostages left out of the 101 that are still in Gaza. This is, of course, a horrible thing to say out loud, and we had hoped to recover all of them alive. I think it's a dangerous moment, and I think maybe even made more dangerous by the fact that after Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, was killed, there may no longer be any one person that knows where all those hostages are. And that is obviously a scary thing. He needed to be liquidated, but now this is perhaps the price that needs to be paid. And so we continue to look at efforts being made by the government of Israel and by philanthropists offering rewards for those that come forward with hostages. We'll hope that money may be an inducement for them. But, you know, I think we can safely say at this point that the hard fighting is done in Gaza. In the meantime, in the north of Israel, we continue to see a massive amount of weapons coming into Israel, destruction, death, injury. Look, this is the bad news, of course, that there's something like 200 missiles and rockets and drones coming into Israel every day right now out of Lebanon. The good news here is that we're getting reports from the Israelis over the last years, which I'm sure you have, Steve, and many of us have. They were warning of the possibility of perhaps 3,000 rockets and missiles and drones per day. The Israelis have actually done amazing work in reducing their capabilities. We now know that the arsenal is less than 50%, maybe even less than 80% of what it was. With 20% to 50% of those rockets remaining, they're unable to fire off 3,000 rockets per day. They're not able to overwhelm Israel's defenses. That said, there is still a limited amount of missile defense that Israel can deploy at any given time. And so rockets are still getting through. There is going to be a huge reconstruction effort that is going to be needed in northern Israel. Israel has sustained a lot of damage, and this obviously puts us in a position where we just need to try to get this war over in the north as soon as possible. There are efforts underway, diplomatic efforts. The Israelis have done, I think the IDF has done a terrific job in clearing out the vast majority of the threats in southern Lebanon, hopefully leading everyone to a place where we could see the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. The last front that I'll get to, I think the Iraq and Syria fronts have been relatively quiet. The Houthis, as I mentioned, may be, winding down. The big question really at this point is Iran itself. The regime has vowed to respond to Israel's attacks in October. The Israelis, as we all know, did I think it's not widely understood or not fully appreciated what they did in that strike. They took out all of, or nearly all of, the Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, leaving the skies over Iran naked. I mean, the Israelis can come back and do what they wish when they wish. That is an amazing achievement in and of itself. The regime in Iran is very vulnerable. On top of that, the Israelis were able to take out the production facilities for the ballistic missiles. They found the choke points, the things that without certain production capabilities, Iran could not produce more of these missiles and threaten Israel. The problem that remains right now is that Iran has something like 2,000 or 3,000 ballistic missiles left in its arsenal. This means that they can continue to fire volleys at Israel, forcing Israel to use its upper tier of its defense, its missile defense systems. So the Arrow system, and of course the US has deployed the THAAD system as well to Israel to take out some of these ballistic missiles. Iran still has the ability to threaten Israel. Of course, what Iran needs to remember is that if it chooses to engage in hostilities again, if it once again is aggressive toward Israel, Israel now has the ability to fly back into the skies over Iran and to do immense damage, to take out ballistic missile storage facilities, to take out possibly energy facilities, and even to take out some of that nuclear infrastructure, which I'm sure right now is a huge temptation for the Israelis. And I dare say it may even be a temptation for the outgoing Biden administration as this president molds what his legacy will be in the Middle East.
What do you see as the factors in the Biden administration in terms of possibly reducing Iran's ability to perpetrate evil throughout the world by taking out some of those key installations, or so to speak, riding into the sunset? What are the factors? Who are the pushing points on either side of that debate?
Look, Steve, I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm not sure exactly how to answer it because obviously, I'm not in that room, nor are you. We can't tell. But I mean, I think there are a couple of general observations that we can make. Number one is, this president was at the helm when Russia invaded Ukraine. He was at the helm when Hamas invaded Israel, when Iran launched its seven-front war. The world is more dangerous now than it was. I think we can say that without equivocation. And this president has to now be thinking about his legacy. How did he leave the world? What is the state of America? I think after the electoral loss of the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris having lost the run for the presidency, the return of Donald Trump, I think, this has probably focused the mind of the president right out to think even more about how he wants to leave the state of affairs for America, for the world. So then comes the question, there are people who've been saying that the president needs to withhold weapons from Israel. And he has, of course, threatened this. You could see a president that decides to go after Israel with sanctions against settlers in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, because they've already been doing that and threatening to do more. That's a possibility. They could take a page out of the Obama playbook and lower the shield, so to speak, at the UN and allow the anti-Semitic international body to once again target Israel and go after Israel in a very public way. That would be one choice that the president might have. The other is, of course, to give the Israelis the weapons that have been withheld, to give the weapons to Israel that the IDF needs in order to finish the job in Lebanon, or to perhaps even do what is necessary in Iran itself to neutralize that nuclear program. There is even the option of the U.S. joining. Now, I'm not saying that this is a high likelihood, but let me just remind viewers that right now there are B-52 bombers, long-range bombers that can drop really large ordnance on very specific targets in Iran. They're in the region right now, purportedly to deter the regime from attacking Israel. But these are offensive weapons. These are platforms that can be used to neutralize assets of the nuclear program that are, dug well beneath the ground. These targets that Israel may have a harder time striking because it doesn't have B-2s or B-52s, these long-range bombers that can carry some of the larger bombs, right? These, bombs that are 10, 20,000 pounds. These are the things that the U.S. has that Israel doesn't. Of course, the United States also has naval assets in the region. We have an additional squadron of American fighter jets that are in the region. This is a pretty significant posture right now. Now, we could say this is all wishful thinking, but I would just remind viewers that, again, this is a president who's thinking about his legacy. I don't think he ever was anti-Israel. I think some of his anti-Israel rhetoric or anti-Israel policies in recent months have been really a reaction to the politics of his own party, which I think at this point we can now look back in retrospect and say they were damaging. I think it hurt Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania. I think it may have hurt her in other places as well. So I think this is a president that has a lot of interesting choices on his plate right now. I can't tell you where he's going to go, but he has options, and those options are very interesting to me.
Talk to us a little bit about Lebanon. As you've mentioned, Israel's reduced the drones by probably 70, 75%, the missiles anywhere between 50 to 80%, the launchers probably even in a higher percentage. And at this point, Hezbollah can do damage, but it cannot existentially be a threat anymore to just destroy the whole infrastructure of Israel. That's been reduced. Hezbollah is losing by the day. On the other hand, Israel could be in southern Lebanon, they could be in the Bekaa Valley, they could be in Beirut for the next 2 years, and you're not going to remove every particular missile, every particular launcher. There's an attempt, I understand, on behalf of Israel, on behalf of America and others, to try to come to some resolution. Where do you think right now is the head of the remaining members of Hezbollah, whoever's representing Hezbollah? Where is their head in this?
So the man who now leads Hezbollah, his name is Naim Qassem. He is not a military mind. He is not a strategic mind. This is the man that created Al-Manar, the television station that Hezbollah uses for propaganda around the Arab world. This is the Goebbels of Hezbollah. And I don't see him as being particularly adept. I think he's probably almost entirely controlled by the regime in Iran. And so Hezbollah, I don't think, is making choices right now. I think the regime in Iran is making choices on behalf of Hezbollah. The big question in my mind, well, there's two. I mean, the first is there are still ballistic missiles. We saw Hezbollah fire Fatah 110 short-range ballistic missiles at Ben Gurion Airport, for example, just the other day. They have certain capabilities left that concern me. They have, by the way, precision-guided munitions, very precise, lethal munitions that could hit strategic targets in Israel, like Dimona, for example, or the chemical plant in Haifa, or the Kiryat in Tel Aviv. These are all things that make me very nervous, and they still have those capabilities. They've not trotted them out, probably for fear that if they did so, that would really invoke just a massive, overwhelming response from Israel. And I think we would see the destruction of just about every Hezbollah stronghold. It would be devastating, I think, for Hezbollah, and I think they know it. So they've been holding back on that, but they still have those capabilities. And if they want to go for broke, they could. And that worries me, and I think that's still an option. On the positive side of the ledger, in terms of things, maybe working out in a better way, there is this effort underway by Amos Hochstein. This is the energy envoy for the Biden administration. He has been trying to cut a deal where Hezbollah agrees to withdraw north of the Litani River. This is, of course, pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 1701. This has been in place now for, just about 2 decades, right? This is what international law demands. The people of Lebanon don't want a wider war. They're already suffering. The death toll in Lebanon has already crossed over 3,000 since October 8th. They have suffered. And obviously they're watching infrastructure get pulverized. They don't want this. They've seen this movie before and they know how it ends, and it doesn't end well for the Lebanese people. So the question is, can we decouple Hezbollah in Lebanon from Iran itself? And, really, this is, I think, the big question, is whether the regime in Iran allows for this war to end quietly, sort of a soft landing to what was a really rough takeoff and a bunch of months, more than a year of fighting. Iran, I think, has to understand that they're vulnerable. Hezbollah is vulnerable. Hamas is destroyed. The will is weakening across the region. Israel has the upper hand for now. The thing is, we just need to see, will this administration, will the international community, and can Israel, through strength, convince everyone that this is not worth the fight? This is the big question as far as I'm concerned. But let me just be clear. Iran still has capabilities, those 2,000 ballistic missiles. Hezbollah still has those precision-guided munitions. There are about 1,500 of them. If Iran decided that it wanted to wage an intense multi-front assault, they could do severe damage to Israel. Israel is still vulnerable here, but it has the upper hand. The question now is, again, does Iran acknowledge this? Do they realize that this is not the fight that they want to have right now, that this was ill-advised, and that it's time to stop?
In terms of Gaza, another situation where you almost have a headless horseman. It doesn't seem that there's a central control. Right now, there's a group of contractors that are coming in. They're going to be taking care of the food distribution, which is an incredibly positive information, because that way you don't have Hamas stealing the aid, stealing the food, and using that to fund their operations. Is this the beginning of a series of steps that hopefully will allow for someone else to take control? I mean, I know it's a good first step. If we were a chess player, what are the next steps that happen after we take away Hamas's ability to steal the food from the population, that takes away their funding and their ability to fund their operations?
Well, Steve, I mean, I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge here is that Israel has done something remarkable and long overdue, and that is to ban UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, from operating inside the Gaza Strip. This is a UN agency that has been essentially allowing Hamas to operate in tunnels under their facilities, to actually use their facilities for military means. The people on their payroll took part in the 10/7 attacks, and they continue to propagandize and to indoctrinate kids. It is a loathsome, disgusting organization that needed to be shut down, and we're now seeing that happen. And we're now looking at alternatives to come in to distribute aid and to provide some of the humanitarian assistance that UNRWA was supposed to be doing, in the best interest of world peace and all of that. It never happened under UNRWA. We now have an opportunity for a fresh start, which I think is it's incredibly positive, and really full credit to the Israeli Knesset, which, we like to say, I mean, they can't agree on the color of hummus right now. They're fighting about everything, but they agreed on this. And I think that's because there was no question about how bad they were. So now this leaves an opportunity for rebuilding. The big question in my mind is, can we get the Saudis and the Emiratis involved? This is the thing that I think the Israelis have been talking about with the United States, with the international community. You get the Saudis and the Emiratis involved, what you have is some legitimacy from the Arab world to rebuild, to try to turn Gaza. I don't know if it's possible, but people have talked about trying to turn Gaza into Singapore, rebuild it, demilitarize it, provide it with the kinds of infrastructure and services that might actually satisfy the people, make them feel proud about where they live, and invest in this area. And maybe to also decouple it from the Palestinian Authority, at least for a time, given how toxic the PA has been. I mean, actually coming out and overtly eulogizing Yahya Sinwar after he was killed. This is, of course, the same Palestinian Authority that's been doing the whole pay for slay scheme, where they've been actually financing the families and, in fact, sometimes the people who carry out attacks against Israel themselves. So, I think what we're watching is a process where the rest of the region, the United States, the Europeans, maybe even the UN, they're looking at the evolution of Gaza. They see that Hamas is no longer. They see that we need an alternative, and they see that the tide of the war may be shifting. I need to stress may, because it's still very fluid. But I think there's this moment now where we potentially see an opportunity for rebuilding. I've seen plans. I don't know which one is the front runner right now, but the best one that I've seen separates Gaza into 4 sectors, each one anchored by a major town. So Jabalia, Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah. In each one of these sectors, anchored by one municipal center, then you start to build out schools, police, hospitals, sanitation, water. And if each one of those sectors are developed by a funder, by the UAE, by the United States, by Saudi, by Europe, they have a chance, right? It's manageable. It's small enough. You've got, let's say 250,000 or 500,000 people that you need to service in each of these sectors. It's manageable. It's doable. But let me say one more thing about Hamas. There is an opportunity here for the Biden administration to do something monumental. The remaining Hamas leadership is almost entirely based in Qatar. Qatar is at least it's said to be an ally of the United States. And they have said to be, they're negotiators for a possible agreement over hostages. They purport to be, third party, disinterested. We know they're not. We know that they are sponsors of Hamas. They're funders of Hamas. Hamas has a headquarters there. The most recognizable leaders, the only recognizable leaders of Hamas are there right now. I'm talking about Khalid Meshal and Khalil al-Hayya, Hussam Badran. These are some of the names that we know are still left. Not a lot. My sense is that if the administration leaned on the Qataris, told the Qataris that it is time to put these men under house arrest, force them to go on Al Jazeera, which is a Qatari-owned television station that has been very pro-Hamas, that has been cheering for Hamas and whipping up a frenzy across the Arab world to root for Hamas in this conflict. If these men were forced to go on to Al Jazeera and to declare surrender, this would be the end of the war. This is where Hezbollah stops fighting, because they have vowed that they will fight as long as Hamas is fighting. That would be crucial. But I would say there's even one more thing that the Biden administration should be forcing the Qataris to do, and that is after Hamas surrenders on Al Jazeera, they must also call for the release of all of the hostages. If this were to occur, I truly believe that the war would end. Why this administration has not yet done this makes no sense to me. This is the clean way to end the war. It doesn't mean necessarily that Iran stops fighting Israel or that it gives up on the idea of the destruction of Israel, but the wars surrounding Israel on its borders would end if this simple step were to be taken, and it is within the power of the Biden administration to do this in the 2.5 months it has left.
if we could go a little bit further, because I think probably most of us who are participating in this briefing, have a tremendous sense of disappointment in the administration in terms of the policies vis-a-vis Israel, the slowing down of the withholding of weapons, the public abuse of Israel. The decisions of the administration have proven wrong, consistently wrong every step of the way. You have a new administration coming in. We don't know who will be the next Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. We hear possibilities of Mike Pompeo, of Tom Cotton, a very, very different worldview, a worldview that probably those who have a broader perspective would say, when it comes to a Tom Cotton and a Mike Pompeo, have done much more for the world to bring about stability and peace for the world, and have a greater insight into how these terror organizations, how Iran works, and how they respond to American pressure, and what America can do and should do and has failed to do over the course of this war. What would you project if the Biden administration really does nothing, in terms of the next few months? What do you see coming out of a Mike Pompeo, a Tom Cotton, or the other possibilities of who runs the State House, who runs the Defense Department?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple things that I would say need to be done in preparation if we don't see positive steps taken by the Biden administration. I mean, the first thing on day one is to lift the restrictions on those 2,000-pound bombs that are being held up, as I understand it, not by the Pentagon, not by the White House, by the State Department. The State Department,
they're sitting in warehouses in North Carolina waiting to be shipped.
That's my understanding. Parts of them may have arrived in Israel, but not all of them, which is obviously not sufficient. I mean, what good is part of a bomb when you need to assemble them and use them in a war of survival, in what I have been calling Israel's, second war of independence? It's outrageous. And so that hold needs to be lifted. That's, I think, probably, job one. Job two, and by the way, we've seen now that Brian Hook, the former envoy for Iran, appears to be coming back. He's leading the transition at the State Department. I don't know whether that means that he's going to be envoy again, or whether he's going to be undersecretary or deputy secretary. Nobody knows at this point. But the return of maximum pressure on Iran, the financial strictures that we had put on the regime during the Trump years had nearly bankrupted the regime. They were running on fumes when it came to accessible cash reserves. That's important, right? So, I mean, look, you could tell Israel, go ahead and bomb the Iranian energy sites that would, that are the things that provide money to the, to the Iranian regime's war machine. But the other way of doing that is just simply put those brutal strictures on the regime so that it can't move money around the world. Cut it off from the banking system, right? Make Iranian oil toxic again. This is the stuff that, should be happening. Now, from there, I think there's also some, there's kind of an interesting idea that, I've been kind of chewing on, which is, if you remember, we had the hostage crisis in Iran, right? After 1979, after the regime came to power in a revolution. And this was ultimately, one of the things that led to the downfall of Jimmy Carter, we'll recall. And we had Ronald Reagan step in, and it was kind of an amazing thing, but he engineered the release of all the American hostages, and he basically engineered the end of this crisis with the regime before he came in. Exactly how he did that is not entirely known, but it was certainly a combination of diplomacy and threats. It basically said, you don't want me starting in my job when I come in January with a crisis or a war against you. And I think that there is an opportunity for Trump to send similar messages to the regime right now, that it's time to end the hostage crisis, and it's time to end the war. This is, I think, something that should be conveyed right now by the incoming administration to the regime in Iran. Now, of course, there's no love lost here, right? We know that the regime has tried to take out the president. There have been plots against the president-elect we know that the regime has actually tried to target him. We know that they have hits out on people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Brian Hook. This is a way for the regime, if it really wants to, save itself, this is the time for them to cede that these were all mistakes and that they're going to stand down. If they don't, I suspect the pressure will build on them, and it won't be just financial pressure. I think Israel, if you saw the spokesperson for the Trump campaign, went on Israeli Channel 12 yesterday, she said something interesting. She said, the president wants this war to end soon after he comes in, but he wants it solved with decisive victory. They've already signaled that they want Israel to win in no uncertain terms. So the regime has to be feeling some pressure right now, and I think that is a good thing. They should be feeling nervous because they have, I think, been playing on borrowed time.
Yeah, it's a shame that we haven't heard that kind of language and messaging from the Biden regime, because this war could have been over months ago. It's really a shame. Question for you. Take this situation when the Hezbollah sends those ballistic missiles, or they send a barrage of missiles. What's happening on the ground in terms of the launchers that sent those missiles? Are they immediately eliminated by Israel, even if they're embedded in civilian areas?
That is that's the easiest way to prevent additional missiles from being fired, because there are fewer launchers than there are missiles in Hezbollah's arsenal. So in other words, it's a strategy of Israel to take out those rocket launchers when they can. Now, what Israel has, it's actually a really remarkable system. They've put this in place for years now, actually, where they have satellites that are constantly monitoring, as well as reconnaissance drones that's monitoring Lebanon. And the moment that a launch is detected, the Israelis can actually dispatch an armed drone, or if they have an F-15 or F-16 or an armed chopper in the air, they can immediately go to that spot and very precisely take out the launcher. It doesn't mean that every launcher gets struck the moment that something is launched, but it does give Israel an opportunity. It affords them an opportunity to take out that choke point, right? If you only have, let's say, I don't know, let's say you've got 1,000 launchers, 500 launchers, but you have, 10,000 or 50,000, missiles and rockets. Well, then take out more launchers and the rockets become very large pieces of furniture. And that is, I think, the goal that Israel has. Now, of course, these launchers can be rebuilt and they can be done in crude ways. But this is a big part of what Israel's doing. But don't forget that the targets that Israel, that they're taking out right now across Lebanon, right? We are talking about areas under homes, like in basements where there is a large amount of weaponry that's being stored. When the Israelis see through intelligence that these are homes that need to be destroyed, they actually call for the civilians to leave. They give them ample time, not enough time for Hezbollah to mobilize and to fire what is underneath those homes, but enough time for the people to get out of the way, and they destroy the entire structure. So they're hitting those things as well as the launchers. And then, of course, they continue to take out military personnel, whether it's in cars, whether it's in homes, whether it's in bunkers. I will just say this, Steve, the intelligence that Israel is using right now against Hezbollah is simply remarkable. I wrote a piece about this for Commentary Magazine in their November issue. Certainly recommend that folks on this call read it. But one of the things that I picked up in talking to a bunch of senior former Israeli officials is that when you think about the war in Gaza, this is like the Israelis have had to fight Hamas every 3 to 4 years on average for more than a decade and a half. There's not a lot of surprises that the Israelis are able to pull off after a time. But since 2006, the last war between Israel and Hezbollah, the Israelis have been gathering intelligence and they have been preparing operations, some of them remarkable, as we now know, the pager and walkie-talkie operations, the strike on Nasrallah, on his successors, right? All of these things were the result of unbelievable intelligence and new capabilities that were being stored up by the Israelis, and they're not done using them. We continue to see them wield these capabilities and this intelligence in ways that is just devastating Hezbollah. And I think we can expect to see that for some time to come. The really exciting thing, though, is to think about, look, Israel fought Hezbollah in 2006. They've actually never done anything inside Iran until just the last couple of months. My question is, what other kinds of capabilities does Israel have there? Because if things do escalate, the Israelis will, they've already put some of their capabilities on display, taking out those air defense systems, taking out those ballistic missile structures, the manufacturing plants. That's all good, but now what, right? There are some interesting things that we may yet see. I actually truly hope that we don't need to see them. I hope that Iran stands down and acknowledges defeat. But if push comes to shove, I suspect Israel will have to go in again, and we'll see different capabilities put on display.
It's been a long war. The fatigue to these soldiers, especially the reservists who need to get back to their families, need to get back to work, to university. It's been a very, very long war. And on the other hand, each and every month, we see incredible strides and incredible success on behalf of the IDF, on behalf of the Shabak, the Mossad. They're gaining ground each and every month. So it's a challenging situation. Takes a human toll, but on the other hand, I think it's probably taken a much more severe toll on the other side being Hamas and Hezbollah.
I think so. And I'll just say this, Steve, just what, I think in keeping with your mission, when I speak to Israelis, the one thing that I have heard consistently throughout this, yes, we know that there's an economic toll. We know there's a human toll. There's been loss of life. There's been injury. There's exhaustion. There's trauma. All of those things, I think, are undeniable when you look at what has happened in Israel since October 7th. But I will also say this, that the pride that I hear from the parents and the grandparents and the man on the street in Israel is unmistakable. They look at the new generation of fighters, the young men and women who were in their 20s that did not have the opportunities to fight in these previous storied wars in Israeli history. And there was, I think, a lot of fear that this was like a screen-obsessed generation. These are people that were doing TikTok dances, and they weren't going to be as serious. They weren't going to be as lethal. They weren't going to be as professional as their parents or grandparents who had made history in Israel, that they had forged the country at a time of crisis. I think now it is undeniable that this generation has stepped up, that they have performed beyond expectation. And this is the one thing that I actually, you don't like hearing about the reports about the trauma and the death and the destruction and, the sadness, that there is unmistakable pride right now in the performance of this generation. I think that is certainly worth noting here on your program.
Yeah. And they're at the forefront not only of Israel and the Jewish world, they're at the forefront of humanity. It's unfortunately not everyone in Western civilization has a clue or understands what's at stake here, but they're really on the forefront, the front lines of defending Western civilization. And they've done it in such a dignified way, with such determination, as you've mentioned, under a condition where they've had so much loss, so much pain, but at the same time, they just keep moving forward. Jonathan, thank you. It's a challenging situation, and I think that the point that you made is there's no sense of closure until these hostages are returned. And until there's a way, and that's why it's fascinating what you said about the pressure should be put on the Qatarians. Qatarians are the bankers. You know, the evil that they perpetrate through Al Jazeera, poisoning the minds of the world, is just horrific. And America has leverage on the Qatarians, and it needs to be used. Thank you very much.
Steve, great to be with you. Keep up the good work yourself.